they matched that sense of the power of the individual to a belief that you're not responsible for the consequences of your actions, which is incredibly convenient in the startup world,
Yes.
right? Because if you can disrupt without being responsible for the people disrupted,
Yeah.
and you cite only the first half of the Schumpeter paragraph on creative destruction, you don't go to the rest of the paragraph where he explains to you, of course, you're responsible for taking care of all the people you disrupt. I mean, that removes so much friction. And their insight about removing friction from the startup process, I mean, I have such admiration for that insight. The problem is that they were so successful that the companies got to a scale where they couldn't help but be responsible for massive impact on society. And the notion that they weren't responsible was not going to hold up politically. In fact, it was complicated in the case of Facebook's properties and Google's properties by essentially having the loudest voice in the public square in every country in which they operate, which was the whole civilized world, essentially, and especially the developed world and Europe and the Americas. And in those environments, when you're the loudest voice in the public square, when you dominate politics, you have responsibility that you cannot shirk. And when you're not elected and you're not accountable, you had better self-regulate. Or you wind up with what we wound up with, which is
a train wreck.
Which is a lot of train wrecks, right?
Yeah.
And if you will...
Trains piling up everywhere.
When
you look at this quote, though, actually, I think to dovetail into what you're saying, the might is right, libertarian, Ayn Randian, kind of Stanford, PayPal mafia worldview. You had Sean Parker, who was part of that, my friend Sean, who did Plaxo and really learned how to grow things quickly. And you talk about that in the book, which is amazing, by the way. And you read it. Thank you for reading it. I love when the author reads their own book. That, when you look at Zuckerberg's clip that we just played, where he says, listen, there's no way that you can tell me that a little bit of fake news is going to influence somebody's ability or swing an election, when in fact, at the same time, he knowingly had teams manipulating people's emotional states on the platform as an Maslow, Stanford experiment gone wrong. And he sits there and lies.
Well, actually,
and says it's not possible. But how is that not a bold-faced lie? And Zuck better than I do, having been his mentor in the early years. How can he say something like that when the sales team has a deck and they're going out and selling people on winning elections with the platform, and then he says you can't win the election with the platform?
I don't want to pretend that I know exactly what was going on in his head, but I'll say this about Mark. Mark is incredibly idealistic in the sense that he had a vision at the beginning, which was true when he was 22, the day I met him, that connecting the whole world was so important and so positive an idea.
Noble
in the most extraordinary way, that it justified whatever means were necessary to get there. And there's the flaw, because Mark really has always had trouble imagining people using the platform differently than he would use it, or differently than he intended. So the idea that somebody would try to tip an election was just not something he could imagine. And the key thing is, I think to this day, we still have not actually surfaced the real problem here. The Russians helped to get Donald Trump nominated, with what they did over Facebook and what they did over Instagram.
Pretty clearly.
And what they did over Twitter. Now, in the general election phase, the theft from the Democratic National Committee and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, those had a profound effect, but they weren't manipulating social media.
No, that was just straight up hacking.
Right? Those were straight up hacking.
That's Julian Assange, Russian agent.
But when you look at Stephen Bannon's incredible insight that you could use Facebook to invert politics. So instead of politics being about persuading the voter that your candidates 2 or 3 big policy objectives are the most important thing on earth. You sit there and you find the weakest emotional point for each voter, and you essentially have N number of campaigns, where N is the number of voters out there. And so it's the same Truman Show idea they apply to ideas in general. You're now applying to an election. And so if they find out that you are like, well, you're passionate about bulldogs, and they realize that in a country as polarized as the U.S., you're not going to move many people from Clinton to Trump or Trump to Clinton.
No.
But what you can do is cause people not to vote.
And that is the most sinister of this, isn't it?
And so what happened, what they did, which is unbelievably clever, is they targeted 3 communities: suburban white women, people of color, and idealistic young people. And they would find for each individual voter what was the thing that most animated them. And then they would somehow find a way to position it that both candidates were dishonest on that issue. So in your case, it would be both candidates have bulldogs for dinner, right? They have roast bulldog. That's what
bulldog
they like
cannibalism.
to eat.
This is crazy.
No, it's just awful.
Just awful.
Just awful. And you certainly wouldn't want to vote in an election that
I'm
was
not
like
voting
that.
for a bulldog killer.
Exactly. I wouldn't either. And so they suppressed both of our votes successfully.